Hello, it's Lone Wolf 368. In this episode, we're going to look at Northern Soul. This is the story of Northern Soul. It's an ongoing journey that started back in 1974 and continues to be a big part of British culture even today. So, Northern Soul was a genre of music which had its origins in the American soul scene of the 60s. Now, in the early days, it was mostly based around Detroit. The initial fans of this music were predominantly black, but as time went on, it gained a following from other ethnicities. Now, what set Northern Soul apart from other types of soul was that it wasn't necessarily the more commercial stuff that would have been played on the radio. In fact, a lot of the music that was being played at Northern Soul all-night dance events didn't really get any airplay at all. A lot of it was actually considered to be sort of too raw, too gritty by the more commercial radio stations. But the people who were playing it, and those that were listening to it, knew that this was authentic soul. It was around 1967 when the term Northern Soul first appeared. And this was because there was a surge in popularity of these all-night dance events that were being held in clubs up north, particularly in places like Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, and Newcastle. Some of the more well-known venues included the Twisted Wheel in Manchester, the Casino in Liverpool, the Locarno in Blackpool, and also the Star in Newcastle. At these events, the DJs would play music that appealed to the people that were there, and it became obvious that there was a real demand for this type of thing. People would go to these all-night dance events and they would dance non-stop to the music that was being played. Many of them were students and they couldn't get enough of it. They wanted to hear that sort of gritty, authentic sound of the Motown era. And so some of the biggest stars of that time that were coming out of Detroit, people like Edwin Starr with his classic Stop Her on Beat Gladys Knight and the Pips with their massive hit, I Heard It Through the Grapevine. Another great one is Love Train. Then, of course, you had Martha Reeves and the Vandellas, another great one, Dancing in the Street. And then, of course, you had the Jackson 5 with their mega hit ABC. These were just some of the big names that were really popular during the 70s. However, there were many, many more that were also loved and played at these all-night events, and many of them were not necessarily commercial singles, but they became anthems for the Northern Soul scene. One of the biggest hits of the period was a track called You Can't Hurry Love by the Supremes. Now, this was initially released as a single in 1966 and didn't make much of an impact on the charts at all. But a year later, it was included on the soundtrack for the movie The Trip. This is where it then got a new lease of life and became a massive hit, reaching number 1 in the UK. Another track that was also included on that soundtrack was I Wish It Would Rain by The Temptations. Again, another massive hit for the Northern Soul scene. And then you had songs like Do I Love You, Indeed I Do, by Frank Wilson. This was another favorite. And then you had Betty Wright with Clean Up Woman. And again, this was another massive hit. But perhaps one of the biggest of the lot was a track called Love Won't Let Me Wait by the Originals. This was a massive anthem for the whole period, and it was played at every single Northern Soul all-night event. There was also a female DJ who was a big part of this scene. Her name was Julie Felix. She was a bit of a pioneer for women in the male-dominated world of DJing, and she was well known for her specialist knowledge of soul music. In fact, she was responsible for playing a lot of the more obscure and rarer tracks that were becoming favorites amongst the growing number of Northern Soul fans. However, it wasn't long before major record labels realized the potential of this burgeoning scene, and they began releasing compilations featuring the more obscure tracks that had become favorites at the all-night dance events. One of the first of these was the Do It Yourself album. This came out in 1974 and featured a variety of different artists. It was a double LP and was compiled by Alan Freeman. He was a DJ and a writer. Then, the following year, another compilation came out. This one was called Northern Soul Fever. Again, another double LP, and this was put together by Dave Godson. He was another DJ who was well known for his specialist knowledge of soul music. By this time, Northern Soul was starting to gain a wider audience outside of its original base in the north of England. People had begun traveling from all over the country to go to places like Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, and Newcastle just to experience the all-night dance events. It had really taken off, and it was now a nationwide phenomenon. Although it was mainly popular up north, there were still various clubs that were hosting Northern Soul all-night events down south. For example, in London, there was a place called the Regal in Notting Hill. There was also the Torch in Kilburn, and then the Passage in Soho. Many people who were involved in the Northern Soul scene during this time went on to become well-known DJs in their own right. For example, you had Dave Godson and also Mike Shaft. Mike Shaft is still going strong today. In fact, he's still a DJ and he's still involved in the Northern Soul scene. So you could say he was very much at the forefront of this movement. He's still a DJ and he has a show on a station called Gem 106 in Essex. He's also been a presenter on various shows on BBC Radio 2. He's still going strong today. In fact, he was awarded an MBE in 2015 for his services to music. There was also another DJ called Colin Curtis. He was well known for his specialist knowledge of Northern Soul, and he was also responsible for discovering many rare and obscure tracks that went on to become favorites amongst Northern Soul fans. He sadly passed away back in 2015, but he's still fondly remembered by many of those who were part of the Northern Soul scene. One of the things that set Northern Soul apart from other genres of music was the emphasis on the music rather than the artist. In other words, it didn't matter who was behind the vocals as long as the music was good. This led to many different artists being given the opportunity to showcase their talents regardless of their background or race. In fact, one of the most popular tracks at Northern Soul all-night events was a song called I'm Crying by The Passions. Now, this track was originally recorded in 1968, and it was actually the B-side of a double A-sided single. It was not until 1975 that it was then released as a single in its own right, and it reached number 3 in the UK charts. Then, a few years later, the track was covered by another artist called Joe, and this version also went on to become a big hit. However, neither of these versions are considered to be the definitive version of the song. That accolade goes to a version that was recorded by a lesser-known artist called Lee Fields. His version was never actually released as a single, but it's still considered to be the best version, and it's still regularly played at Northern Soul all-night events. One of the other things that set Northern Soul apart from other genres of music was the emphasis on the DJ. The DJ was seen as almost a selector of the best music, and they were given a lot of respect by the fans. In fact, many Northern Soul fans would travel to different cities just to see a particular DJ play. It wasn't uncommon for DJs to receive fan mail and to have people asking them for advice on what records to buy. Some DJs even had their own fan clubs. In the late 70s, Northern Soul began to lose some of its popularity, but it never really went away. There were still plenty of people who were keeping the flame alive, and there were still plenty of new fans who were discovering the music. In the 1980s, Northern Soul experienced a bit of a revival. This was probably due to the fact that the music was starting to be played on the radio again. And this time it was getting airplay on stations like Radio 1. One of the most famous DJs to play Northern Soul on Radio 1 was a guy called Mike Reed. He had a show on Sunday nights, and it was called Sounds of the North. This show was incredibly popular, and it helped to introduce a whole new generation to the music. In the 1990s, Northern Soul experienced another surge in popularity. This time it was being played on stations like Kiss FM and Choice FM. In fact, there were quite a few pirate radio stations that were playing Northern Soul at this time. One of the most popular stations was a station called Laser. It was a pirate station that was set up by a DJ called Paul Archer. He was already well known for his specialist knowledge of Northern Soul, and his show on Laser quickly became one of the most popular in the lineup. In the 2000s, Northern Soul continued to be popular, and it's still going strong today. In fact, there are now plenty of websites and online radio stations dedicated to the genre. One of the most popular online radio stations is a station called Northern Soul Radio. It plays nothing but Northern Soul music, and it's available to listen to all around the world. And so there we have it, the history of Northern Soul. It's an amazing genre of music that has stood the test of time, and it's still going strong today. If you haven't heard it before, I highly recommend checking it out. You can find lots of it on Spotify and Apple. Thank you so much for watching. Please do leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Also, check out our other content. Until next time.